We're in? We're in. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to session 3, and for anybody that was watching us online, I apologize for that. I realized there's like a million moving pieces to this whole tech setup, and one of the last things I always do is every week I change, this picture that you see on the screen right now, I put it onto the computer that Mr. Thomas is using back there to live stream from, so that he can start the live stream with just a still picture and then fade in once we're all ready to begin. So if you feel like I rushed you all getting started today, that's because I looked it down and realized I forgot to update that picture, so anybody online saw session 2, What is Evil, and might have thought they were watching the wrong week. So I was like, no, really quickly, just fade us in so they could see session 3, The Moral Argument for the Existence of God. So out of curiosity, I don't know if anybody's read the chapter ahead of time this week, so you could probably already tell what I was telling you before was true. It's getting deeper every week, right? But this is also, boom! But this is why we do two things. Number one, this is why you have the earlier weeks, and it kind of builds, and so it does kind of build on itself to hopefully that makes it a little bit easier. That's also why we have these class sessions, so that a lot of this conversationally, hopefully it can come across more clearly. Yes?
I have my schedule that we're doing 3, but 4 and 5 are together.
4 and 5 are together for next week. Yes.
And then skipping a week.
Well, Thanksgiving, yes. We're not going to be here for Thanksgiving.
And then it's after.
And then after that, yeah. So we have 1 person watching us on YouTube, 5 on Facebook. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, so this week is just chapter 3. Next week is chapters 4 and 5. And the reason is because I want to make sure we have time to get to chapter 7 on that last class, which is kind of the practical how to show some real life examples and kind of taking everything we've been talking about and putting it all together.
I figured our last time we'd be in here would be December 9th.
December 9th is correct. Yeah. Yeah. So it's from this point on, it's kind of like 2 weeks on, 1 week off, 2 weeks on. So we're here this week, we're here next week, and then we're off for Thanksgiving, and then we're back the first 2 weeks in December.
Yeah, December 2nd and December 9th.
Correct, December 2nd and 9th, yeah. And then we will be done, and then I have to, I think by the 16th, no, it can't be the 16th because it's on a Sunday, so 16th would be the following Thursday. I don't know, it's sometime maybe a week or so after that when I have to submit, I have to have a final meeting with my department chair, and then I have to actually submit the revised, version of the book by the end of the term here, and then I'll be done. Yay! So, although let me tell you, and this has nothing to do with the class whatsoever, but I did find out that you have to pay for graduation, and I put that in there, and they say you also have to take this Bible exit exam. And I have to take a Bible exit exam. And I remember when I first got admitted, I did have to take a Bible entrance exam. It doesn't count as a grade or anything. I guess they're just trying to see, if they taught you anything while you were here. And even the exit exams, it doesn't count, doesn't affect your graduation at all. You're good. But I also am thinking, it's like, okay, but everybody has to take this Bible entrance and exit exam. And to be honest with you, my particular degree, while there's been some of that, is not really focused. Like, I didn't have to take an Old Testament course or a New Testament course. That's not the focus of it. It's an apologetics course. I had to take some theology courses. But that, so it's like, really, you want me to take a Bible? I got a feeling that my Bible exit exam is going to look a lot like my Bible entrance exam, but okay, if that's what you want to do. I'm consistent, yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's what we'll go with. Yeah, I knew so much at the beginning. There was nothing else for me to learn, right? Yeah, God, don't strike me down. So, anyway, welcome everybody. We do have a lot to get through tonight. And it's kind of dense. Now, I do have to say, for those of you that read the chapter ahead of time, and if you've been in one of my classes before, some of this tonight might sound familiar because I've taught the moral argument for the existence of God in a number of different classes, probably never as in-depth as we do here. You're already shaking your head. I go, nope, not as, I said, yeah, I've heard this before, but not like this. But there is my favorite example of the person walking along the street and someone else jumps out of the alley and punches him in the face. We'll get to that a little later in the class. And I'm going to tell you right now, in case you read that in the book and saw the names that I selected for these people are not the names I usually do. And there's a reason for that. I am a class classic movie buff, and I'm giving you until between now and when we get there to figure out the movie. If any of you get it, I will be very impressed, to say the least, because so much so that I wrote it wanting to do this movie reference because it's one of my favorite movies of all time. And when I went back to edit it, even I forgot why I did that. So, and then I'm like, oh yeah, it was that movie. So when we get there, if you can, it's the names. It's not the whole scenario. The scenario I use in all sorts of classes. It's the names that I chose for these two characters. One is obviously the victim. One is the bad guy, and that corresponds to the movie. I'll give you that hint. And if you can figure this out, I will be duly impressed, and I guarantee you none of you are going to get it. And online, it's a challenge as well. The same challenge extends to all you who are watching online. If you can, when we get to there, or if you have the book, you can look at it. If you can name the movie, type it in on the live chat in YouTube or the comments section on Facebook, and I will be duly impressed. Here on YouTube, looks like Gail says hello to BA and myself. Hello, Gail. Apparently she doesn't say hi to any of you. That's okay. She doesn't know who you are. You're not on camera. So Jean Brown says hello. She's watching as well. So thank you all very much for watching. Gail here says, I thought that example sounded familiar. Yeah, it does, right? 'Cause I use it in every single class. It's like the facts are the same, only the names have been changed. So we'll get to that when we get to it. All right, so let's talk about the moral argument for the existence of God. All right, why do I put this in a book about evil? All right, why is this even an issue? Well, because evil is a moral term, right? There's two types of ways we can describe things, maybe more, but the two I'm going to use right now is, let's say that I were to describe somebody who walks into the room, and I say that person is tall, that person has brown hair, maybe I'll say that person is smart. I'm describing this person, or I'm describing these walls and say these walls are blue, or this wall is white. What I'm doing there is I'm describing what is, all right, the way things are, all right? Moral terminology, though, doesn't describe the way things are. Edna's joining us now on Facebook. Hello, Edna, thank you for joining us. With moral language, I'm describing the way things ought to be. So when you start hearing language like you should do something, that's the right thing to do, that's the wrong thing to do, all right? When you start getting to that realm of oughts, that's when you're talking morality, right? Well, evil is a moral concept, isn't it? The whole point of evil is this is bad stuff. This is not the way things ought to be, all right? And so the moment a skeptic raises evil and says that this is a problem for Christianity, then they're already assuming a moral framework. Frank Heckel is joining us on YouTube. Good evening, Frank. So the question then becomes, since they're obviously assuming that there is a moral framework, they're assuming morality, what exactly are the implications of that? And what we're going to find through the course of this class is they're actually assuming that God exists. They don't realize it, but the very moment they even mention evil, they're already assuming that God exists. They've already lost their argument before they've even finished presenting it, all right? Here is why, all right? And now we're going to spend the next hour and a half explaining that, but that's the basic gist for why this chapter is where it is in the book, all right? So, let's see. Well, I got to be on the right thing. Here we go. We're going to talk about the difference between moral values and moral duties, all right? A lot of people, we understand this thing called morality. It sounds familiar to us. We understand there are things we should do, things we shouldn't do, but very few people have actually taken the time to sit down. Let's sit down and really think through what this means. And so what we're going to do here at the very beginning of this class is kind of break down what morality means. And morality can be broken down into two things: values and duties. A moral value, what I have here on the screen, is the content of a moral quality. What do I mean by that? All right. Well, how would you define, and you don't have to answer this, this is going to be in giving you an example, how do you define love? What is love? Okay. What is courage? What is all these qualities that you think of if you're describing somebody has a really good character, somebody you really admire, and you were to describe their character and what kind of person they're like? Well, everything that you're listing, that you're identifying about them is a moral value, okay? Love, goodness, compassionate, courageous, all of these things, those are moral values, all right? In contrast with that, we have moral duties. And you can't have morality unless you have both, all right? The moral duty is the obligation to exemplify that moral value. In other words, even if there is such a thing as love, why are we under any obligation to behave that way? All right? Both of those have to be present in any system of morality that you come up with. And when we talk about them being present, there's a philosophical term for that, and we call it grounded, or they're grounding. How are they grounded? That just kind of means what's the basis for them, all right? If I were to give you an example that's outside of morality, if I were to say that person is 6 feet tall, well, what does that mean? Well, we know what a foot is, right? A foot is 12 inches. We could pull out a ruler and we could say that's a foot. So when I say they're 6 feet tall, I'm saying that if I were to take 6 of those rulers, then that corresponds to how tall they are. Those 6 rulers are the grounding for what is meant by 6 feet tall. All right? It's the basis for it, the foundation of that concept. Where does it come from? All right? With morality, you need to do that both with moral values. You have to say, where do moral values come from? And moral duties. Where do moral duties come from? You can't just say, well, some people try, we'll get to, they're out there, all right? You have to actually say where they come from. So if you hear me say about something needs to be grounded, or what's the grounding for moral values or moral duty, that's basically what that means. Just where's it come from? What's the basis for it? Why does it exist? Where do they exist? All right? Now, when we're talking about moral values and moral duties, there are broadly speaking, two different concepts for how you ground them. All right, what their basis is, what their foundation is. The first one we're going to talk about is called moral relativism. All right, moral relativism, according to what we have here on the screen, that is the view that moral values and duties are grounded, remember that's what their foundation is, are grounded in human opinion, consensus, or convention. Meaning, when I say that I think Mr. Thomas is a loving person, all I'm saying is that's what my opinion is. He may not actually, there's no standard to determine if he actually is a loving person. You may think he's not a loving person, all right? And if you think he's not, and I think he is, well, there's really nobody to judge between us. It just, all that moral values and duties is whether it be personal opinion, or sometimes they'll say it's societal opinion or a culture. You know, some people will take it as more of a broad scale. We'll talk about that again here in a minute. But ultimately, there's no authority over anyone to determine one person's right and one person's wrong. And here, let's see, and the Pastor Jay here on one of them on Facebook says, in religion, it says everything is sacred. And I'm sorry, I wasn't looking in time. I missed the reference there. All right. Oh, and Gail says hi to the rest of the class as well. So, all right. So here's the example. Here's your opportunity to name the movie. I will give the example first, and then we will see if anybody can name where I got these character names from, okay? So the example I love to give is we've got Miles. All right, Miles is walking down the street. He's whistling away. He's having a grand old time, all right, minding his own business. And suddenly, Wilmer jumps out of an alley, bam, punches Miles in the face, unprovoked, just decides, bam, he's going to punch him, all right? Now, Miles immediately says, ow, all right? And he falls to the ground, and he gets back up, and he looks at Wilmer, and he says, that was legally wrong. I'm going to sue you. I know a good lawyer. His name is Ken. Okay? I'm going to sue you. And Wilmer looks at Miles and says, that wasn't illegal. I was perfectly within my legal rights to punch you. And then Miles says, no, you weren't. Wilmer says, yes, I was. No, you weren't. Yes, I was. No, you weren't. Yes, I was. They go back and forth. They clearly have two different opinions about whether or not it was legally right for Wilmer to punch Miles. All right? What do they do? All right, are they stuck in that situation? I mean, what happens in the real world when people disagree about legal things? What do? They go to court, right? And then a judge is going to open up a law book. He's going to look to see what the law says, although no judge is going to have to do that on this one. They should pretty much know what the answer to this, or they should be defrocked. No, defrocked is for pastors. You know what I mean? They should not be on the bench. And so they're going to look at this law book, and they're going to see, no, sorry, Wilmer, no matter what you personally believe to be the case, you can't just jump out of alleys and punch people that you want to. If you do, you're going to get sued. Our civil law, our government's law says that's illegal, regardless of personal opinion. So you have these two personal opinions, but there's a third source above them that says which one of them is right and which one of them is wrong. All right? Now change that example just ever so slightly. So now instead of talking about whether or not Wilmer was legally right, we're asking whether Wilmer was morally right to punch him. All right? So Miles says you were morally wrong to punch me. Wilmer says, no, I was morally right, morally wrong, morally right. So we have two different opinions on what the right moral answer is. The question then becomes for us, just like we had that civil law book that determined which one of their opinions was right and which one was wrong, is there a standard of moral law above us all? Remember that word transcendent we talked about before? A transcendent moral law that determines which one of their opinions is correct and which one of their opinions is wrong. Moral relativism says no, there isn't. All there is this level of opinion. And what some moral relativists will do, some of them will say it's just this individual person's opinion, this individual person's opinion. Other will say, no, you have to obey whatever your society or your culture or your county or your group believes. But they also say there's nothing above personal opinions, humanity's opinions, all right? Whereas the alternative, which I got to get on the right screen again here, is moral objectivism. All right, moral objectivism is the view that moral values and duties are grounded in something outside of humanity. So according to moral objectivism, there is that standard above those personal opinions that says, I'm sorry, Wilmer, you were morally wrong to jump out of that alley and punch Miles. All right, is that clear what the difference between the two is? All right, so I'm going to give you a second to finish writing. Mr. Thomas is Googling Miles and Wilmer right now to see if he can find out. No. Let's see. Mr. Pastor J. Jackson is saying Spider-Man. He's going with Miles, Miles Morales, thinking that's Spider-Man. And that is incorrect. We have Caleb Keener on Facebook that's guessing Charlotte's Web, also not Charlotte's Web. Let's see. Classic movies. I will give you one more hint. Well, first of all, does anybody here think they know it? One more hint. 1941. Oh, you didn't know I watched things that long ago, did you? It's a 1941 film starring Humphrey Bogart. It centers around the search for a little statue. Maltese Falcon, yes! Now, here's the trick. Miles was Sam Spade's partner who gets killed, that starts the whole thing rolling. Wilmer, now remember, they originally thought there was this other guy, that she came in looking for somebody, that was the one who really killed him. No, Wilmer was actually the one who we find out later actually did kill Miles at the end. So he was the right-hand man of the bad guy. There you go. You see, I love film noir. I love classic film. Sheila Martin Fritschke did say Maltese Falcon here on Facebook, so I'm going to give you full credit as well for getting that one right. Yes, it was a Maltese Falcon reference. And now that I've said it over and over again, when I go back to edit the book the third time, hopefully I'll remember what my own reference is. So, all right. So, I go out of order on these things sometimes. So you start to see the difference between moral relativism and moral objectivism. There's two different ways we can look at morality. All right. Now, this is a quote from Douglas Groothuis. He's a Christian apologist. All right. And this is, if you have the book, it's on page 30 of the book. All right. And this is where the way he's describing the difference between cultural relativism and objectivism, and specifically the different forms that cultural relativism can take. And this is kind of what I was alluding to before. What Douglas Groothuis says is that cultural relativism, all right, remember I said there's relativism and there's some that say it's just individual opinion and some say it's broader than that. Cultural relativism is the view that it's broader than that. Because cultural relativism teaches that we should follow the moral principles of our culture. Cultural judgments are normative, yet these judgments are binding only for those within the culture. Individual relativism grants no favored moral status to one's culture. Moral judgments and obligations are based entirely on an individual's personal preference. Morality depends on what you think. All right. So, again, relativism, there is no moral law book above us. Objectivism, there is. Now, you can be a moral objectivist, all right, and still not believe in God. You just have to come up with some other source for what you think that standard is. And that's a problem, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. All right, so let me ask you just to look at this this definition we have here on the screen. And again, if you can't see it at home and you have the book, it's on page 30 of the book. And I want to just get your insights as far as what do you think might be some of the problems with a moral relativist view? What problems might this cause for us? Let me rephrase it this way. Why is this not livable?
Their opinions, everybody's right.
In their opinions, everybody's right. Well, why can't everybody be right?
Well, it's difficulty when you're traveling from different culture to culture and you get involved.
When you're traveling from different cultures. And that's something we always need to be aware of, because certainly you have one thing that's, considered morally right in one place and is not considered morally right in another place. We need to be sensitive to that. Although we're going to talk about a quote from C.S. Lewis here in a second, where he kind of says those differences aren't as profound as some people will try to make them believe. Yeah, Bill.
If everybody's right, then nobody's wrong, then everybody's opinion is okay.
And if everybody's right, then nobody's wrong, everybody's opinion is okay. Is there anybody's moral, I'm sorry?
It's chaos.
It's chaos. And let me ask you this, can you think of anybody's moral opinion, let's say from, I don't know, I'm just going to pull something out in the middle of the 20th century, maybe some Germanic country over in Europe, all right, that you think maybe we might want to say their moral sensibilities were wrong?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, or how about, we just go look at our own country to, I don't know, I'm just going to go with some, I feel like going to southern states for some reason. Anybody want to say anything about what's wrong with their morality? Well, guess what? If moral relativism is true, you can't. Because they believed that they were morally right. We may believe they were morally wrong, but if there's no standard above to determine who's right and who's wrong, whose opinion is right and wrong, you literally are in no position to ever judge another person's moral beliefs and moral convictions. And clearly, not only does that cause us problems with things like that, but we all do it all the time. All right, we can't help but do it. And there's nothing per se wrong with doing it in certain circumstances, as we'll talk about here. All right, let's see. Gail says Maltese Falcon was just on Turner Classic Movies. Well, it should be, because it is a classic movie. It is awesome. All right, so we're going to talk about, I want to talk about three kind of pieces of evidence, which we've kind of touched on here with this question that I just asked. Three pieces of evidence for how you can know that moral relativism is not true and moral objectivism clearly is. All right. The first one is getting to what you were saying about the different cultures. And this is from C.S. Lewis. All right. C.S. Lewis, points out that, well, when he's talking about moral objectivism and that rule that's above all of our opinions, he calls that the law of nature. All right. So when you see him talking about the law of nature, that's what he's talking about. Opinion. Here's the objective truth. Law of nature is what he calls it. All right. And he says that when he's talking about the law of nature, he's talking about also that there are people who will point out that we don't think there is a law of nature, because if you go to different cultures around the world, different places over time, they've had different moral codes. And because we seem to have all this variety of moral codes, then there really can't be some objective moral law above us all. Here's what he says. He says, I know that some people say the idea of a law of nature or decent behavior known to all men is unsound, because different civilizations and different ages have had quite different moralities. But this is not true. There have been differences between their moralities, but these have never amounted to anything like a total difference. Men have differed as regards what people you ought to be unselfish to, whether it was only your own family or your fellow countrymen or everyone. But they have always agreed that you ought not to put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. And so what C.S. Lewis is pointing out is that while there are cultural differences, and sociologists will tell you this as well, there's still a common core. If we were to, in other words, we all seem to have these basic moral principles that we all recognize. Now, how we decide to apply those principles may be different. How we decide, like we have a moral principle that says you shouldn't be selfish, all right? Now, then you take that moral principle and you have to decide, okay, well, how far does that extend? What exactly does selfishness mean? Does that just mean that I have to be nice to my family? Or does that mean I have to be, kind to my stranger? Or do I have to, be kind to the Samaritan coming down the street? Yeah.
With people, with all religions, the golden rule seems to be in all religions.
The golden rule, and here's what's really neat about that, okay? And I don't know if you're aware of this or not. The golden rule, yes, you look through religious traditions and you find it everywhere in some form or another. However, it is actually, Christianity stands out when it comes to the golden rule. Do you know how Christianity is different than every other religion that expresses something like that? The fact that Christianity expresses the golden rule, and I could say Judaism, but golden rule as an affirmative duty. In other words, when you see it elsewhere, let me ask you this, what's the golden rule? Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, right? If you look at other religious traditions, you'll see things phrased like, do not do to other people what you would not want them to do to you. So it's more a matter of inaction, whereas with the Christian phraseology, it's no. Your duty is not just to sit back and not do bad things. You have an affirmative duty to go out and do good things. And that's another reason that I love Christianity. But you're right, that same core principle is there. And that's kind of what C.S. Lewis is getting at. We have these foundational principles that we all seem to recognize, which tends to suggest anyway, as one piece of evidence, that there is this objective moral standard above all of our opinions that we all seem to appreciate, whether we outwardly say it or not. When you start asking us what we think is morally right and what's morally wrong, you're going to find this core set of beliefs that everybody shares. They just differ on how to apply them, if that makes sense. Yes, exactly. We're all given a conscience, and I can't remember if that was in this chapter or another one later on, where I talk about Romans 2:11 or 16. It's in Romans 2. I think it's in this chapter, so maybe I don't want to spoil it. where that's exactly what Scripture tells us. There's a portion of the book where it says moral relativism is unbiblical, and I think it's in there. So I think we're going to get to it later on. It's on page which? 33. We're getting there. I'm about to be on page 31, so we're almost there. But yes, exactly, and that's what the Bible teaches. All right. So that's piece of evidence number one, that we have these common beliefs that everybody seems to share. Piece of evidence number two is that nobody really lives in such a way that they believe moral relativism is true. Even philosophers that say, I believe in moral relativism, no, they don't. You want proof they don't? Steal their wallet. Don't steal their wallet, okay? But you get my point. What's going to happen when someone steals their wallet? Are they really going to say, gee, well, I mean, I think that was wrong, but that person obviously felt it was okay, so I guess I can't judge them and they just get my credit cards. I'm not even going to bother canceling them, you know? Or are they going to call the police? They're going to report their credit card stolen? Of course they are. Because they still believe in practical reality there is that standard above us that applies. And this is another C.S. Lewis quote, which I love. He says, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a real right and wrong, you will find the same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he will be complaining it's not fair before you can say Jack Robinson, right? And that's the whole point. When people usually, when they try to claim that morality is all relative, it's usually because they don't want other people telling them that they're doing something wrong. And they want to justify the fact that they can do whatever they want. But the moment somebody does something to them, all of a sudden, they don't act like a moral relativist anymore. They act like a moral objectivist. All right. Let me take one last look here before we move on to make sure I'm not missing anything. All right. And Mr. Thomas has very generously put links to the Maltese Falcon in the comments section. So if anybody wants to go back and watch it, it's also on HBO Max. If anybody has HBO Max, which is where I watch it over and over again. Not my favorite Humphrey Bogart movie, though. Anybody want to guess what my favorite Humphrey Bogart movie, which coincidentally is also my favorite movie of all time?
Oh, it's the river one. African Queen.
It is not African Queen, but that's a very good one. It is not. Casablanca. Yeah, I love Casablanca. All right. Let's see. Where are we at now? I did that one. All right. So, piece of evidence number 3. All right. This one's going to be a little more complicated, so I'm going to see if I can give an example on this. All right. Something called the credulity principle. All right. Let's talk about science. And this is an example I gave in a message I gave about, I don't know, what was it, a month ago or something? I was last in the pulpit, I can't remember. Where I took out a softball and I threw it up. Before I threw it up, I said, what's going to happen when I throw this ball up in the air? And what did we say was going to happen? It was going to fall back down. And I asked, how do you know that? How do you know it's going to fall back down? Why do you say that? Because it always does, right? Gravity, because we assume that's the way gravity works, because every time we've thrown a ball up in the air in the past, gravity has made it come back down. And so we reasonably believe that that ball is going to come back down. Just because it's always happened before, does that logically mean it has to happen from that way all the time in the future? There's no logical reason why it has to, all right? It's an assumption that we make, and every single person here, everyone watching online, I don't care if you're watching this as a Christian, as an atheist, whatever, every single person would agree that's a reasonable assumption to make, all right? If you look at something that, happens this way over and over and over again, all things being equal, if there's no evidence to suggest the contrary, you are justified in assuming that it's going to behave that way again. What? Logically, there's no logical reason it has to. Just because something has happened some way 10 times does not mean it's logically required to do that again the 11th time. There's no rule of logic that says that. It's just that we assume it's going to do that because it always has in the past. Now, I also threw a very important caveat in there. I don't know if you caught that, in case there are any other skeptics watching this down the road, where I said all things being equal or no other evidence to the contrary. Why do I say that? Because this is an objection that gets lodged against Christians all the time. Well, some will say it's our universal experience. I'll disagree with that one. But what is our by and large experience? Dead people say dead, right? Once dead, always dead. And so they'd say, well, wait a minute, Ken, you're contradicting yourself, because then if dead people say dead, then we should all just assume that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. Well, no, because there's a lot of evidence that he did. All right, that's not the point of this class. It's another class. We'll talk about that later, but if you really want to. But the point is, but all things being equal, if you don't have any evidence to suggest that this is going to be an exception, and in the case of the ball, if it's, and here's an exception, is that Mr. Thomas is standing next to me with his hand up here ready to catch it. All right, then you're going to be justified, so you'll have some other evidence to believe that just because I throw it up, it might not come back down again. But if you don't have that evidence, then you are justified in believing that the way it's always behaved is the way it's going to probably behave this time again. All right, so we see that in science, right? Are these first principles, and that's what the credulity principle says. We should reasonably believe what is apparent or obvious to us unless there are overriding reasons to dismiss it. All right, that's the credulity principle. Now, just like you need to have starting assumptions in order to do science, I got news for you. You need to have starting assumptions in just about everything, including morality. All right, you can't even, the rules of logic and reason only work once you have a starting point, once you have some starting statement you're talking about. You make this statement, now we can apply the rules of logic to see where that leads us. But unless you have a starting assumption, you're not going anywhere. And so with morality, we do have some instincts, all right? Some things that seem obvious to us. So much so that we'd say if someone doesn't agree with us on this, and I don't care if you're a Christian, if you're atheist, if you're Muslim, if you're Hindu, there are certain things that everybody's going to agree with, and if you don't agree with it, we probably think you need help, all right? For example, it is morally wrong to kill innocent children for fun, to torture babies for fun, all right? Does anybody in this room not agree with that statement? All right. So far, all the classes I've ever asked that question, nobody's ever said yes, you know, which is, although I've talked to somebody who, I know of someone who was giving a speech at one point, somebody did say, well, I can't say that's morally wrong. It was somebody who was trying to be a moral relativist, and one of the things was to say it outwardly, but then, of course, you'd say, okay, come here, I'm going to punch you in the face. No, you don't. You don't do that. But that's kind of thing. If you look, there's certain principles, like it is morally wrong to torture innocent babies for fun, all right? We can all agree with that, all right? Do we have evidence of that? I mean, can you prove that? No, we have this gut instinct that we all recognize it, just like C.S. Lewis was talking about, where there's certain moral things that we all recognize, all right? Unless we have some strong reason to think otherwise, some overriding reason to think otherwise, everybody would agree, whether they outwardly say it or not. We all acknowledge those types of things we are justified in believing to be true. We're justifying that. So the credulity principle as applied to morality says just that there are certain moral assumptions that we are justified in holding universally. Well, if that's the case, that again shows there's some objective moral standard above us, okay? You may have this opinion, this may have this. You may have somebody over here whose opinion is it's okay to torture innocent babies for fun, all right? But if the credulity principle, I can't talk tonight, the credulity principle is correct, then we are justified in saying, no, you're wrong. There is this principle that all of us sane people recognize to be true, all right? So that's another reason to believe morality is objective, not relative. And what's important to recognize in regard to this is that if moral relativism is true, guess what? You can't say torturing innocent babies for fun is wrong. That even though that's all of our almost universal gut instinct, all right, we have to reject that. We have to actively fight against our instincts. We have this internal conflict in us all the time if moral relativism is true. Moral objectivism, though, makes it all mesh together. All right? All right. So, I think I kind of answered this already, but if we didn't have the credulity principle, in other words, if we weren't justified in saying and acknowledging things like, yeah, we have these gut feelings that everybody seems to agree on. These aren't things that, you know, half society agrees with and half doesn't. But there's these things that we can all acknowledge are true. If we had to reject that, what would life be like? What would our society be like? Everybody for themselves. What do you think? This is a little bit more deep question, I guess. On a societal level, you're right, it'd be like everybody for themselves. What about an individual level? How would it feel to you if you have these inner convictions that, by the way, you share with just about everybody, But you constantly have to remind yourself, oh no, that's not right. Oh no, that's not right. Oh no, that's not right. I mean, what would that do?
When we were talking about the Buddhists in the beginning, how nothing is real.
Well, yeah, that's a good parallel. Like with Buddhism, you're right. It does kind of lead to that. And Vedanta Hinduism does the same thing in a different way. But the idea, for those that are online that didn't hear what Barb was saying, is that with Buddhism, where you don't really even have your own self. You are just a collection of experiences. There is no you that actually exists. And yet everything you feel day in, day out tells you there is a you that exists. So again, you're constantly internally, you're constantly living like this, And so it creates both societal conflict and internal conflict if we don't accept this credulity principle, which again, ultimately we all do accept the credulity principle. Some people just don't like to admit it. All right, but when it comes down to living and the way we live our lives, we all really do accept it. All right, so that is all the philosophy stuff. Let's talk the Bible stuff, all right? Let's talk the Christian stuff. Let's see here. Okay, Gene Brown here talking about the ball. Yes, good example. Says we're talking about we were talking about whether you have those any reason to reject it. We would say if I throw the ball up, it's going to come back down, unless you have some overriding reason to think otherwise. And she's pointing out if I'm in outer space, that gives you an overriding reason to think it's not going to come right back down again, right? Same thing. Absolutely good example. All right. So let's talk about the Bible part of things here, all right? And this is starting on page 33, all right? And this is from Romans. I was close. It was Romans chapter 2, verse 14 is where it starts. I want to say either 11 or 16. I should have split right in the middle there. But verse 14, listen to what Paul says to the church in Rome. He says, do I have it on the screen? I think I have this one. Got to be on the right thing here. Here we go. There it is. All right. He says, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. What is Paul saying here? Tell me in your own words. What's he saying?
Even though they're not Jews, they still have the same moral principles, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal.
Yeah, even though they're not Jews, so they weren't at Sinai and they weren't given the 10 Commandments that says thou shalt not kill, they still have this moral law written on their hearts that they understand that they shouldn't be killing, So there's this moral conscience comes from being made in the image of God, folks. All right, that's part of the image of God that's ingrained in us. But what you see here is, what is Paul describing here? Is he describing moral objectivism or moral relativism? Objectivism, right. He's saying that regardless of what you believe, that you have this law on your heart that sometimes accuses you. In other words, it tells you you're wrong. And other times it affirms you, says you're right. All right, because there is a standard above our personal opinions that determines that sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong, and somehow that standard is actually ingrained in every one of us, which gets back again to what C.S. Lewis was saying. There's these general principles that societies all across time and everywhere have all acknowledged to be true. They just disagree on how to apply them.
Now, even Jews, Gentiles, like God too.
Exactly.
Gave them a conscience too.
Exactly. Everyone who's made in the image of God, Jew or Gentile alike, all right, they were made in the image of God, so they have this written on their heart as part of that image. Now, you're going to see as we get through this class where exactly that comes from, and hopefully I'll make that even more concrete about what it means to have, as a result of being made in the image of God, what is it about God that's been imprinted upon us. We'll see that here in a second. All right. So, see, sometimes I just get going and I lose track of where we are. There. Okay. All right. So we're looking at page 34 now. How Christianity grounds morality, all right? There's two things that we need to talk about, all right? So we talked about what moral values and duties are. We've talked about, okay, morality has to be objective, all right? Which means if it's objective, then there are objective moral values. There is such a thing above us that defines what is love, what is courage, all of that, whether we agree with it or not. And there are objective moral duties. Remember, any system of morality has to have both values and duties. So we have to show then, as Christians, how does our Christian worldview explain that? Where would we say, consistent with our theology, objective moral values and objective moral duties come from? And of course, the short answer is, well, God. Okay, but we're getting a little more specific than that. All right. Here is a slide that kind of gives you the short answer, and we're going to go through the long answer here. Objective moral values can be grounded, again, remember that term is that based foundation. They can be grounded in God's character, and objective moral duties can be grounded in God's personal nature. Let's talk about what that means. All right. Let's say you want to describe someone. Remember that person we were talking about before? You have a friend, and you think very highly of them, and so you're going to describe them. They're honest, they're trustworthy, they're kind. What are you doing? You're listing off character traits, right? Character traits that person possesses. Because we all have a character. Every person has a character. Well, guess what? So does God. All right? God is personal, so God has a character. However, if I were to describe Bill Rearig as a loving person, Tony, don't say anything. Okay? Bill does a lot of really loving things. For those who don't know, he's still one of the leaders of Stephen Ministry, right? Yeah. You are the leader of Stephen Ministry, right? So Bill does a lot of real loving things, all right? Does that mean, and now Tony, you can comment if you want to have some fun, does that mean that Bill is perfectly loving? There's no flaws in that character trait of him whatsoever?
Oh, he has flaws.
Oh, he has flaws. But neither are you. Exactly. All right? Even someone who we describe as being a loving person, they're not perfectly loving. All right? Who is? God. So when we describe God's character and we say God is loving, there's no blemishes there. All right? He is perfectly loving. In fact, that's what gives that term meaning. Whether people realize it or acknowledge it or not, when I say Bill Rearig is a loving person, all right, what I'm really saying is he has a character trait that resembles that character trait in God. That character trait in God is the standard. All right, it's what gives meaning to what I'm saying, to how I'm describing Bill. All right, that's the foundation for it. And so I'm saying, Bill, your character trait resembles that character trait in God. Now, we all know, I'm not saying he perfectly resembles that character trait in God, but the closer you get to, you don't need to keep disagreeing, okay? But the closer you get to that trait, the more loving you are. And the further your behavior and your character gets from that trait, the less loving you are, right? So God's character has these values in it, and those values are what ground our sense of moral values. Whether we realize it or not, that's what we're doing. We're saying, with that person I'm saying they're loving, that means they resemble that attribute of God. Okay? So that's how we ground moral values in a Christian worldview. Now, that in and of itself is not good enough. Like I said before, if you just even if you could ground moral values, if you can't also ground moral duties, you haven't succeeded. All right, you haven't shown that you have a viable moral theory. All right. With regard to moral duties, I've said those can be grounded in God's personal nature. And I think I already gave this example, whether it was last week or the first week, I can't remember. But this is one I like to give. Let's say you walk out of this class and you're walking next to me and you decide you're going to kick me into the flower bed. All right? Have you done something morally wrong? Please say yes. Thank you. Okay. Why have you done something morally wrong? Because you owe moral duties to people. All right? If, however, you leave here tonight and you kick a rock into the flower bed, have you done something morally wrong? No, because you don't owe moral duties to a rock, all right? You owe moral duties to people, to persons. Now, I know there's a lot of New Age beliefs nowadays that might disagree with me on that and say, no, we owe a moral duty to the earth. Well, we as Christians will admit that we do have a moral obligation to take care of nature, all right? That's because we are stewards of God's creation. Everything belongs to God. He's kind of put us in charge of running it. And so out of our duty to God, the ultimate duty is to God, but because we owe this duty to God, we have to take care of it. It's just like if a friend trusts you to watch their dog while they're away on vacation, all right? You then have a duty to take good care of that dog or to house sit. Let's say that, you're house sitting, all right? You have a duty then to take good care of their house. Is it because you owe a moral duty to the house? No, it's because you owe a moral duty to the friend that asked you to watch the house, okay? Same kind of thing when it comes to nature with us. You owe moral duties to people, all right? Which means, just like we have to have that standard that defines what those values are, you have to have a standard that defines what those duties are, but that standard has to be a person. Because if it's not a person, you wouldn't owe any moral duties at all. So it has to be a person. So that alone tells you that in order to have more objective morality at all, that whatever that transcendent source is, that source above opinion, all right, it has to be a person in order for us to have any obligations whatsoever. All right? All right. How are we doing so far? Good. All right. Let's talk about Plato. Not Play-Doh, the stuff that you make little vegetables and stuff out of, but Plato, all right? Now, this is page 36. What we're going to look at now is, so I've shown you so far what morality needs to look like, all right, what a system of morality needs to look like. We've talked about how Christianity can meet that, can show where moral values and duties are grounded, where they come from. But just because Christianity can do it doesn't necessarily mean that nobody else can. Maybe someone else has a theory that also gives us a good grounding for objective moral values and duties. And we obviously don't have time to go through every theory that's been thrown out there. But here's a big one, and it comes out of Plato's theory of forms. The theory is called the brute fact theory. It's this idea that moral values and duties are just brute facts. We'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, but first by going through Plato's theory of forms. Now, what Plato said, all right, is that there are real things out there called forms. They're just like we talked about transcendent moral duties and all that. There's these things that exist in our minds, but they are real. Case in point, let's pretend that I walk up to a blackboard and I draw a triangle on it, all right? I just pick up a piece of chalk and I draw a triangle. Is that triangle going to be a perfect triangle? No, because I'm an imperfect person, right? No matter how hard I try, no matter what kind of protractor I use, if we were to look at it microscopically, we're gonna find there's some error in it. We can't draw a perfect triangle, quite literally. However, we all still recognize the concept of what a perfect triangle is, right? So even though we can't necessarily create it right here ourselves in the real world, we still understand in our minds what a perfect triangle is. This concept exists. This form, is what Plato called it, of a perfect triangle still exists. All right? Mathematics is the easiest way to illustrate that. But then what he also said, all right, was that in the realm of morality, the same thing. Plato proposed that there were perfect forms of morality, of moral values, all right? So he says we all recognize, just like we can recognize a triangle even though we can't draw it perfectly, we can all recognize this thing called love that exists even though we're never perfectly loving, all right? Because he says there's a perfect form that exists in our minds of what love means. Now, as far as Plato's gone here, we can kind of agree with that, all right? We can say, yes, there is a perfect form of love. It's in God's character. That's where it's at, all right? Here's where the disconnect, I think, comes in with some skeptics. What the brute facts objection says is they rely on this idea of Platonic forms, that's what we call it, all right? And it says, look, why can't morality just be these brute facts? Why can't it just be like these Platonic forms that just exist out there? And the answer is, Why would it be? Think of it this way. All that is, and I say it kind of brutally, I think, in the book, but I'm going to stand by it. That's a cop-out. That's a cop-out. What that basically is saying is, well, we think there is this perfect form of love that's out there, and so we're going to stop asking any more questions at that point. We all agree it's there, ta-da, we're done. Hold on. We as Christians agree it's out there. But then we can take it one step further and say where it is specifically. We don't just kind of say, oh, there's this mysterious ether somewhere that exists these perfect forms. That's kind of what Plato was saying. We can say, no, we agree that there is a perfect form of love, but that exists in God's character. So when the brute facts approach just basically says, it kind of stops the inquiry unnecessarily. It just says, so why can't we just agree that there's brute facts of love? There's a brute fact of love, and that's enough. Well, because you have to convince me why that's enough. Why should that be sufficient? And here's the other problem with the brute facts theory, all right? Do you owe a moral duty to the perfect idea of a triangle? No. What's that? If you're in an orchestra, no, then you owe the duty to the conductor. Or whoever's signing your paycheck if you're a professional in the orchestra. No. Here's the thing. Even if there's such a thing as love that exists and we don't know where it comes from, maybe you don't even ask where it comes from, it's still not a person. It still has to be a person in order for us to owe any moral duties. So the brute fact approach really just, it's a cop-out. It's just basically saying, okay, I'm just going to take my inquiry this far, and then I'm just going to put my hands over my ears and say, la, 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 I am not listening to Christians, la, 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 la. I mean, that's what it is. It's like, well, wait a minute, we don't have to stop there. And you're just refusing to look any further because you don't want to look any further because you're afraid where looking further is going to lead you, is essentially what it boils down to. But again, this is why whenever anybody's trying to talk about morality to you, just think of those two things, values and duties, because where most of them get hung up on is that second one with the duties. Because you've still got to figure out, even if you could explain, so many people just try to explain the values and say, I'm going to come up with some place where love can exist. Okay, why do I have to be loving? Whatever you say, why do I have to obey that? Unless you can answer that question, you haven't answered anything at all. All right? And the forms theory does not do that. All right. My watch thinks I'm working out because I'm flailing my arms so much. All right. Oh, let's see. Oh, we did that page already. Look at that. All right, so where are we at right now? It is 7:57. Let me take one last look here at the comments, see if there's anything else on here. Nope, we're good. All right. Let's move on to the next one. Now, after all of this lead up, this chapter was titled The Moral Argument for the Existence of God. But Ken, you haven't given us a moral argument for the existence of God yet. Well, now I'm going to, but of course you'll see why we had to explain everything else first. All right, what is the moral argument for the existence of God? All right, here it is. Now this is again by Douglas Groothuis. This is based on values. He kind of breaks them down separately. He does it for values and duties, but you'll see in a second it's the same argument. It says, if a personal God does not exist, all right, then objective moral values do not exist. We just talked about that, right? If we don't have this objective standard above us, or if God doesn't exist, rather, then you can't have this objective standard above us because nothing else can explain that. It has to be personal, right? Number two, objective moral values do exist. That's what we talked about. Everybody recognizes they don't say they don't steal their wallet, okay? They don't steal their wallet, but steal their wallet, but don't steal their wallet. All right, they're all going to get it. Therefore, put it together, therefore a personal God exists. Now, this is a logical principle called modus tollens, all right? Let's make it even easier to see, all right? Modus tollens, the logical formation of it says this: if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. All right, break it down real easy, this argument at the bottom of the page. If Joe is a bachelor, then he is unmarried. Joe is not unmarried. Therefore, what? Joe is not a bachelor. You see how that all follows here in this argument. It's the exact same argument form. Don't believe me? Take a look. All right. If Joe is a bachelor, that's P, then he is unmarried. That's Q. Joe is not unmarried. That's not Q. All right. Therefore, Joe is not a bachelor, not P. See how that form works? Now look at it for the moral argument for the existence of God. If a personal God does not exist, That's P. All right. Then objective moral values do not exist. That's Q. Objective moral values do exist. Not Q. All right. Therefore, a personal God exists. Not P. All right. It's the Bachelor argument. And I don't just mean what you see on that TV show all the time, because they have lots of arguments on that one. All right. I don't watch that show. Please don't watch this thing. Oh my gosh, Ken just admitted he's a fan of The Bachelor. Oh, no, I'm not. Do you hear the, I don't remember which one it is now. Do you see, I saw a commercial. This is a total side note, so you can finish writing this down if you want to. The latest, I think it's The Bachelor. You know, they're always millionaires or something, aren't they? They're supposed to be like rich people. And I saw this ad that came on and says, I already don't know why anybody would go on that show. But they have two guys up there. And they say, oh, look, you're going to get to choose one or the other. Oh, one of them's really rich. One's got nothing. And we're not telling you which is which. It's like, really? So this is what we're going to be building a relationship on. I mean, is that really what matters to these women that are going on this show? And of course, they flip it with the Bachelorette all the time, too. It's like, so, oh my gosh, you might not be rich. I don't want to end up with that one. Sorry. Okay, rant over. Why do these girls do? All right. So, and this is just the other one that Douglas Groothuis says. It shows you the exact same argument works for moral duties. If God does not exist, there are no moral obligations, moral duties, all right? There are moral obligations, therefore God exists as the source of moral obligations. That's what Douglas Groothuis says. And I've seen some people lump them into one argument where they'll say, if God does not exist, then moral values and duties do not exist, and they put them all together. You can do it either way. The argument's the same, no matter what. All right. So that is the moral argument for the existence of God, which hopefully you can now see based on all the groundwork we did, which is why I'm putting this in a book on evil. Because the moment somebody says there's such a thing as evil, they're assuming moral values, they're assuming objective moral values, and what have we just seen? If they're assuming objective moral values, they're assuming God exists. They've lost their argument before they've even started saying it, all right? So, and we'll talk a little bit more at the end here about what the implications of that are. Let's go back to Plato one more time, though, all right? Because some people, a very famous objection that people raise against the moral argument for the existence of God is called the Euthyphro objection, or the Euthyphro dilemma, or the Euthyphro dilemma, depending on who you ask, all right? And this was a dialogue. Plato used to write in dialogues. You know, he'd have like characters talking back and forth to each other. And in one called Euthyphro, this is what he says. He says, he had one of his characters say, the point which I should first wish to understand is whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved of the gods. All right, well, what does that mean? I know Plato, but here's what that means. All right. What he's actually asking there is when God commands us to do something, all right, and says, thou shalt not steal, for example, is he commanding us to do something because that thing he's commanding us to do is good, or does it become good because he commanded it? All right, does it just automatically become good because he commanded it, or was it good beforehand, in other words? And what the objection says is supposedly that puts the Christian in a dilemma. Because first of all, we can all see, if it just became good by the act of God commanding it, what would have happened if God had said the opposite? What would happen if God said, you should murder people? Then all of a sudden, if it was the act of commanding itself that determined whether it was right or wrong, then once he commanded that, that means murder would be right. And that doesn't sit well with us, does it? And supposedly the flip side of that is, but wait a minute, but if he commanded it because it was good already, then that means there must be some higher standard outside God that God's appealing to determine what's right and what's wrong, and he's using that to determine what his command should be. But if he does that, that means that God is now, he's not sovereign anymore, is he? He's not the supreme authority. There's an authority above God that even God is appealing to. That's the Euthyphro dilemma. Is this really a dilemma? Well, I got news for you. All right, and this is lawyers do this trick all the time. Okay, lawyers will present something to you as if there's only two alternatives, and it's obvious there's only two alternatives to make you think that either alternative you're hung on, right? And when that kind of thing happens, what you really need to do is ask, are there really only two alternatives, or is there a third? All right, and this gets back to everything we were talking about how Christianity grounds moral values and duties. Remember that. When we described where moral values come from. We said they come from where? From God's what? His character, right? Is his character inside of God, or is that something outside of him that he's appealing to? It's inside of him, right? See, what Plato did here is he created a false dilemma, because he said, look, there's only two options. Either God is just determining what's right or wrong when he commands it, or he's appealing to some standard of morality that's outside and above himself to determine it. No, how about a third alternative? That God is appealing to something inside of himself to determine whether it's right or wrong. And if he's appealing to something inside of himself, namely his character, all right, when he's issuing his commands, then he is still sovereign, and he is still the supreme authority in the universe, and there's no contradiction, okay? That is an objection that, to be honest, even though it's been refuted countless times, I still see this all the time. Many skeptics will still think that the Euthyphro dilemma just completely disproves Christianity's view on morality. No, it doesn't. All right. I had a big, long discussion probably 10, 15 years ago with a guy who was just, I understand that there's supposedly this third option, but I really just don't see how it follows. Really? What's not to see how it follows? You have a character, right? So does God. There you go. Problem solved. You know, it's really not that complicated when you really think about it. All right. So I want to close tonight. What? Hold on. Where am I? Okay. I guess I didn't have a slide for this one. So we'll just go to this one anyway. We'll come to that in a second. I want to close tonight by talking about the ramifications of this conclusion. All right. In other words, we're talking the purpose of this book, of this class, is the problem of evil. All right. And I've already shown you one reason why this is important. All right. And the moral argument for the existence of God is important when we're answering skeptics. All right. A skeptic raises an argument. They say there's too much evil in the world in order for me to believe in God. We can say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by evil? And then we can kind of show how they've already assumed God exists by even asking the question, all right? But leave that aside for a second. There's another very important ramification of the moral argument for God, and that is for us, all right? And that is for people who are going through suffering, all right? If you start to understand this and really internalize it, then when evil happens, when suffering happens, it changes our perspective on it. Now, all of a sudden, we're not in a position of asking, is God even real? Is God even out there? Because we realize in order for us to even be asking the question in the first place, he has to be. And so now the question for us, if we're experiencing pain, if we're experiencing suffering, is not, is there a God? We might be wondering, like Job did, where is God? You know, what, God, I know you're there. I'm just not seeing the reason for this. I'm not seeing why I'm suffering in this way or why my loved one is suffering this way. I'm not getting it. And sometimes God will show you, and sometimes he won't. Okay? But if you've seen all of this first, then you never reach the point of questioning whether God is real. You can't, because you realize that your question doesn't even make sense if God isn't real. All right? And so it changes our focus. It changes our perspective. Now, is this something that if you're actually in Stephen ministry, you're talking to somebody who's going through suffering, you're going to sit them down and say, let me tell you about the moral argument for the existence of God? No. All right? This is kind of like this is a bad word now today's age. This is kind of like a vaccine. No, I'm sorry. Painful point for some people, I know. But think of it. The idea you take a vaccine ahead of time, right, to prevent yourself from getting the disease down the line. This is something that you study ahead of time so that when you are going through suffering, if you've already internalized this, it's going to be one more thing that's going to help you get through. But it's certainly not something that you're going to ask someone to rationally walk their way through when they're in the throes of that, so to speak. All right. Any other questions about that? Otherwise, we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing next week. All right. So now, okay, really, are there any questions about that? I'm sorry, I'm calling you all out. All right, you guys that are online don't know what happened last week. Last week we had a great conversation for like 10 minutes after we went off the air. It was fantastic. And I don't, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm sure it was just one of these thoughts that come up, but then that thought leads to another thought, and that caused somebody else to ask a question, so somebody else to ask a question. We had a fantastic conversation. So I'm just going to sit here for a second to make sure. No other questions? Good. So, yes, Bill.
suffering, we feel that since they're suffering, and since the doctors and the medications aren't working, that therefore God doesn't exist in their life because he's ignoring you.
Well, I guess number one, the question was, what about people who are suffering, but because, you know, the doctors, the medicines, nothing's working, they feel that God doesn't exist in their life because he's ignoring them. If you mean by God's not existing in their life, they don't think God cares, or they think that God actually is punishing them for something. See, that's different. If it's one thing to say God's not real because of this, that you just can't say in light of this. You can't. But do some people say, well, God doesn't care? I don't think God cares about me. Sure, that's a real struggle that people face. Now, I will say this, and because I see this, I saw somebody on Facebook who's a Facebook friend of mine, and more than that, I'm not going to say who it is, but somebody who's very close to me, who's not just not Christian, but very anti-Christian, posted something the other day on Facebook that says, if I hear one more Christian tell me when I'm going through a hard time, oh, don't worry, it's all part of God's plan, I'm going to scream. All right, and this is what this person said. And, you know, my gut reaction is to say, well, that's not really what Christianity teaches. That's a little, you know, it's more complex than that. But ultimately, do Christians say that? Yes, we do. All right, and we mean well by it. I know we do. But Christianity, remember we talked about in week 1, we talked about one of the differences between Christianity and Islam. And we talked about Islam. We said in Islam, God's primary, or Allah's primary determining factor is his will. All right, everything that happens because Allah willed it to happen. So if you're suffering, it's because Allah willed you to be suffering. All right, that's not what Christianity teaches. Christianity is more a matter of God created free will. That's one of the things, and free will in and of itself is a good. And so it's not that God says he wants you suffering, it's that God created free will. Free will is a good thing, and now somebody used their free will to cause your suffering. Or there's other things, we'll get into fallen nature and everything like that. We're going to get into that starting next week, because obviously not everything that happens is the result of, if you start, is a part of the, you threw me for a loop there, B.A. If I scream, it's part of God's plan too. Is that what you said? Yeah. So obviously not everything that goes wrong in our lives is a result of someone else's exercise of free will. Sometimes it's natural disasters, things like that. And we'll talk about that next week. But what I would say to that person is kind of what we talked about in week 1. It's like, well, once you come to the realization and you acknowledge that God is there, I understand you're not feeling his presence right now, but let's talk a little bit about this God who we worship as Christians, who is a God who actually has been there. And we talked about, you know, that idea that it can help you, everything comes down to the incarnation, right? Incarnation can actually help you reshape the way you think too.
A lot of times that's when God said somebody else to be God to that person.
Yeah. And I talked about this when I preached on miracles, that, you know, God, even if it's not an outright miracle, God works in different ways in the world. And sometimes he can work through natural causes. Other times he can just be completely supernatural and do something amazing. And other times he works through people. And he sends people into your life that you need at that moment in time. But you can see where if you've taken this vaccine ahead of time, all right, it can help shape your thinking so much. So it's kind of like a barrier. And this is what I found in my personal life. It's that it kind of acts as a barrier where even when I'm going through the worst of times, my mind will travel so far, but there's a wall that it won't go further than that, because it can't go further than that, because I've already internalized this. You know, and so that's what I mean. So it does help you from thinking too far, you know, if you really internalize this kind of thing. So what we're going to do next week, again, next week we're going to try to get through chapters 4 and 5. I would encourage people to read the book, because in the time we're going to be here, are we going to have time to get through every single thing in those chapters? I'm guessing not, although we've been doing pretty well these last 2 weeks and getting out of here a little bit early. But here's what it's going to be. Finally, in a class on the problem of evil, I'm going to present to you what the arguments are that skeptics are making based upon evil. All right? And next week, we're primarily going to focus on broad categories. So we're going to talk about the category of what are called logical arguments. There's one category of arguments called logical arguments. There's another category of arguments that are called evidential arguments, and we're going to talk about what the difference is between the two. I'll tell you right now, or very few actual professional philosophers nowadays make logical arguments anymore. They're really easy to defeat. Evidential is more where we go with it. And then we're going to talk about, after we talk about these broad categories, some broad Christian responses that are called, well, there's something called defenses, which we'll touch on briefly, and then theodicies, all right? So next week is kind of general, and then the following week, right before Thanksgiving, right? No, after Thanksgiving, the first week after Thanksgiving, then we're going to look at some specific arguments. We're going to talk about, Paul Draper and William Rowe, people who have actually made particular arguments, and look at their specific arguments and see why they don't hold up, frankly. So, all right. One last look online to make sure I don't have any other questions. I don't see any. So, barring none, thank you all. See you next week. All right. God bless everybody.